It gets worse. The U.S. Army War College, based on its interviews with Israeli participants, concluded, quote, "Nor is there any systematic reporting, any, of Hezbollah using civilians in the combat zone as shields. It just never happened. It's all fantasy. It's all made up. If Israel targeted the Lebanese civilian population and infrastructure during the 2006 war, it's not because it had no choice. It's not because the Hezbollah was nested among, intertwined with, embedded in the civilians. The Hezbollah was nowhere near the civilians. They were even wearing regular army uniforms. If Israel targeted the civilians and the civilian infrastructure, it's because terrorizing the civilian population was a relatively cost-free method of education, much to be preferred over fighting a real foe, and the Hezbollah is a real foe, and suffering heavy casualties. In the case of the Hezbollah, it's true what Friedman said. I see no point in denying it. The civilian population was educated. And that's why during the massacre in Gaza, the Hezbollah limited itself to verbal support for the Gazans, knowing full well if they went beyond verbal support, Israel would go in and level half of Lebanon. They were educated. On the other hand, they suffered a military defeat in Lebanon. In the case of Gaza, the Gazans were educated. 1,500 degrees phosphorus incinerating your skin. It's an education. You remember that. And they achieved, you'd have to agree, I think, a military victory in Gaza, if you want to call it a military victory. The reporter I mentioned earlier, Gideon Levy, he said, yeah, we won, but the fighting in Gaza, he said, was war deluxe. Compared with previous wars, it's child's play. Pilots bombing unimpeded as if in practice runs, tank and artillery soldiers shelling houses and civilians from their armored vehicles, combat engineering troops destroying entire streets in their ominous protected vehicles without facing serious opposition. Ours, a large, broad army, is fighting. Fighting who? Fighting against a helpless population and a weak, ragged organization that has fled the conflict zones and is barely putting up a fight. The virtue, you have to say, of Mr. Friedman is a certain kind of what you would call candor. He was pretty honest. And there were others who were not so honest about what happened in Gaza. There's this fellow, his name is Anthony Cordesman. He's a pundit, military analyst. He has a keen eye for the battlefield. He's on all the talk shows, I'm told. So after the Gaza massacre, Cordesman writes what he calls the Gaza war, a strategic analysis. And in the first paragraph, he says that Israel did not violate any of the laws of war during those days in Gaza. Well, that's a provocative statement. Didn't violate the laws of war. That's like reading Herman Melville, "Call me Ishmael." That's a provocative sentence. So I went on to read, where did he draw that conclusion from? And he says he went on this Project Interchange to Israel. He doesn't mention Project Interchange was paid for by the American Jewish Committee. He then goes to Israel. He interviews all of these Israeli officials, all these Israeli generals, all these Israeli spokespersons, And all the Israelis tell him, we didn't commit any war crimes in Gaza. So, of course, what is he to conclude except Israel did not violate any of the laws of war in Gaza? Now, some of you are probably thinking, I'm exaggerating. It couldn't possibly be so gross, so vulgar. And it's true, there was an element of exaggeration in what I just said. He did what you call some of the academic heavy lifting. He did some serious archival research. He read every single Israeli press release issued during those 22 days. And lo and behold, nowhere in any of those press releases did Israel say it committed war crimes in Gaza. So what is Mr. Quartersman to conclude except that it didn't? The opinion, however, of the human rights organizations was quite different. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the National Lawyers Guild, Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, all of them have produced quite massive reports documenting what they called Israel's war crimes in Gaza during those 22 days.